morning, good afternoon, good evening, every time in between. My name is Peter Hayes. I'm the director of the Nautilus Institute in Berkeley, California, although I'm coming to you from New South Wales in Australia. I'd like to welcome everyone to this seminar on nuclear threat and international law. And before I hand the baton off to Professor Marian Hansen, I'd like to explain how we came to be here today. This project had its genesis in a discussion between Carnegie Corporation's then program officer Sharon Weiner with one of our speakers, George Perkovich, in 2023, which led to a 2-year effort funded by Carnegie Corporation in New York to commission papers from India and Pakistan, the paper by Monique, Cormier, and Anna Hood that we'll hear about today, and of course George Perkovich's framing paper and forthcoming Adelphi book. It also resulted in 3 online seminars, this being the 3rd. All these papers and seminars are found online at Carnegie Endowment, Nautilus, and Asia Pacific Leadership Network, which also co-convened this seminar and drew in senior expert members to serve as commentators, for which thank you, APLN. In advance, I'd also like to thank all the staff at Carnegie Endowment, Nautilus, and APLN for producing these posts and events, which has allowed us to reach almost all time zones with at least one of the seminars and a great broadcast of the papers. Now, to the topic at hand. Being somewhat expert on North Korean strategy and having studied American nuclear posture for now nearly 5 decades, I was greatly struck in 2017 and 18 at the height of US-North Korean tension when Trump talked about his button being bigger than Little Rocket Man, whilst Kim Jong-un talked about the dotard running the United States and threatening to nuke Washington and Guam from North Korea. Both were clearly making threats based on their nuclear forces, and being from supreme commanders, this wasn't merely noise, so one paid attention. But as I observed what was going on using a variety of open source sleuthing techniques, the United States didn't depart from its routine deployments, whatever the hot rhetoric out of Washington. And the Korean People's Army was utterly standstill and silent on the ground, even as Kim Jong-un was flame-throwing threat at the United States, especially Guam. Even as he mouthed off, he seemed intent at avoiding the risk of accidental or inadvertent war and or nuclear war. Yet senior people at that time, for example, Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, put the risk of war at greater than 50%, whereas the increased tension seemed to me to make American and North Korean leaders, and importantly their militaries, more cautious than ever, in turn reducing, not increasing the immediate risk of nuclear war. And I couldn't really explain this conundrum of perceived increase in nuclear risk but noting behavior that suggested exactly the opposite. So I was particularly motivated for Nautilus to host the Nuclear Threat and Signaling Project at Nautilus, and to have the privilege of working with and learning from George Perkovich as the principal investigator of the project. So that's how we came to be here. And now down to business. Let me hand off to Professor Marian Hansen, who's Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland in Australia. She teaches and researches international security in many dimensions, especially nuclear weapons, and is a leading member from Australia of APLN. Marian, off to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers and commentators today. Our first presenter will be Professor George Perkovich. George is currently Japan Chair for A World Without Nuclear Weapons and a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Nuclear Policy Program. George has held numerous posts with prominent organizations and has published widely in his field. His forthcoming book is titled Rethinking a Political Approach to Nuclear Disarmament. George will be followed by Professor Anna Hood. Anna is a public international law academic in the Faculty of Law at Auckland University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She specializes in disarmament law, international law and security, and provides advice to a range of civil society organizations and governments. And her publications appear in several international journals. After these two presentations, we will hear from our four commentators. Our first commentator will be retired Captain Dr. Andy Tian. Andy's military career spanned operational, legal, and academic roles across the PLA Army, Navy, and the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. Andy will be followed by Professor Kazuko Hikawa, who is Vice Director of and Professor at the Research Center for Nuclear Weapons Abolition at Nagasaki University. Prior to her academic career, Kazuko served as a diplomat with the Japanese Foreign Service. Our next commentator will be Professor Paul Davis, a former senior principal researcher at the RAND Corporation and professor of policy analysis at RAND School of Public Policy. Prior to his work at RAND, Paul was a senior executive in the US Department of Defense. We'll then hear from Professor Carrie McDougall. Carrie worked for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs prior to rejoining the law school at Melbourne University. She has provided legal advice on several critical international issues. But for now, let me hand over to our first presenter, George Perkovich. George, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and it's great to be on with all of you, some old friends and some new friends. So what I'll do is briefly summarize the framing paper as Peter talked about it, where I try to suggest ways to assess nuclear threats. And the motivation behind this, as Peter alluded to, was that the term and the notion of nuclear threat, in quotations, have been used much more often and widely than I believe they deserve to be, and that more nuance and care are called for. When the term threats and the use of the term is inflated and the feared actions don't happen, people may become less likely to prepare adequately to respond when the moment is truly dire. This is, in English anyway, the boy who cried wolf problem. Conversely, dismissing nuclear rhetoric and gestures as bluff, which is often done, when in fact the danger is real, could lead to disaster. So more careful analysis can prevent either dismissing real threats or overstating them. You don't want a bully to get a cheap win, and you do want to save a brave defender from a fight it will lose catastrophically if nuclear weapons are used. Now, the challenge in all of this, why this is not so easy, is ambiguity. Leaders often that possess nuclear weapons don't know what they really will do in a crisis or a conflict if it escalates. Leaders often want to keep their options open, so they would like to have it both ways. Say enough that appears threatening to maybe make the adversary back up, but don't get yourself locked in or committed to something that you don't know if you want to do. So be ambiguous. There are legal dimensions, as Anna will talk about. If you say a very, very clear threat, that may be illegal under international law. If you're ambiguous, you can avoid such charges. Ambiguity also grows with the number of audiences that you're attempting to manipulate. So if I'm the leader of a nuclear armed state, my words and deeds are meant to affect adversary leaders and their publics. They're also meant to affect my allies, my domestic population, maybe even particular voting factions within my country, and then powerful other countries around the world who might want to support me, or at least not turn against me, but I want to turn against my adversary. This all means that the intentions and the capabilities and triggering circumstances for nuclear war are rarely crystal clear for leaders, let alone for potential targets. This is indicated by the fact that since 1945, no one has detonated nuclear weapons against an adversary, despite many reported threats to do so. Now, Thomas Schelling, an American economist who won the Nobel Prize and is in many ways kind of a father of nuclear deterrence thinking, he famously summarized nuclear strategy as a manipulation of risk. Risk is calculated by multiplying the probability of nuclear use times the estimated consequences. But I would say that nuclear weapons are unique, and they produce a unique fear in human beings. So what is being manipulated when leaders speak and gesture about nuclear war is fear, more than a rational measure of risk, as I would argue it. Among other things, this suggests when the word threat is overused, fear of nuclear war may cause people to overreact. Conversely, when bluff is misused, fear may be lessened and people will underreact. To try to more constructively describe and analyze what leaders are saying and doing to manipulate fear of nuclear war, I suggest 4 terms in addition to or instead of the simple nuclear threat. The first term is illusion. An illusion, or a nuclear illusion, is a reference to one's possession of nuclear weapons and the damage they could do, which does not convey an imminent threat to initiate nuclear use. So an example is in January of 2023, the Russian politician Dmitry Medvedev said, as Europeans were preparing to send tanks to Ukraine, Medvedev said, the defeat of a nuclear power in a conventional war may trigger a nuclear war. This was reported in many places as a nuclear threat, but in fact, it was an allusion to what nuclear war could mean or the possibility that nuclear weapons are used. I don't think it was actually a threat. Now, a gesture is an action related to the posture of nuclear forces, which the state wants adversaries and potential third parties to detect. So the U.S. has often done this, especially around the Korean Peninsula, when the U.S. flies B-52 bombers over North Korea to gesture an intimidation, a warning to North Korea. Often these planes don't carry nuclear weapons, they're gestures. Another example, in the Ukraine war, when France moved 2 submarines to sea shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this was meant for Russia to see. It was a gesture. It was not even remotely possible that France was intending to go to war and use nuclear weapons. The third category or term I would use gets to more real threats. That is preparation. So a preparation is an action undertaken by a state to prepare for the deployment and potential imminent use of nuclear weapons. Now, ambiguity makes it very difficult to assess detected actions. So when France, for example, put its 2 additional submarines to sea in 2022, this is what it would have done if it was actually preparing to use nuclear weapons. But in this case, it wasn't. So you have to ask, is the situation one where the imminent use of nuclear weapons is remotely possible? Is it more likely that the action is a gesture meant to deter or compel the opponent, not an actual preparation to use nuclear weapons? Is it a defensive measure to protect one's own nuclear capabilities from the possible first strike by the other, rather than moving one's nuclear weapons in order to conduct a first strike against the other? In other words, some preparations may be stabilizing to avoid nuclear war rather than aggressive to launch nuclear weapons. Again, historically, most actions that could have been perceived as preparations for nuclear use were in fact manipulative gestures or defensive measures to protect nuclear forces from attack. Adding all this up, I would suggest that a credible nuclear threat, as opposed to an illusion or a gesture, is when the leader that's empowered to authorize nuclear use in the state makes the statement or the gesture, not the railway minister, not a parliamentarian, but the leader who has the power to use nuclear weapons makes a statement and combines it with an explicit demand against the adversary with physical preparations to imminently release nuclear weapons. And to be deemed credible, I would say that it should be in circumstances that are dire enough that the leader has taken steps to prepare his or her own people and the world for the risks of nuclear war that he or she may be undertaking. Actions in all of this mean more than words. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn to a graphic that's in the paper. And the first graphic is an ideal type. And I suggest 4 questions for assessing the gravity of verbal manipulations. The first question is, did the leader with nuclear launch authority make or associate themselves with the statement? Then, is there a clear demand made of adversaries? Do the losses experienced by the state in question meet the criteria for nuclear use as defined by that state's doctrine or leaders? And then lastly, is imminent action necessary to relieve the perceived threat to the state or to preempt the adversary from initiating nuclear use? When it comes to physical manipulations, I suggest 5 questions. Is the manipulation secret, that is unannounced? Because if you were really going to use nuclear weapons, it probably would be secret. Is it exceptionally difficult for advanced technologies to detect? Is the action rare? Does it involve nuclear warheads, or, for example, just bombers without nuclear warheads or other devices without nuclear warheads? And finally, is the action more consistent with nuclear attack than with ensuring the survivability of one's own forces? Now, this is an ideal type graphic because ideally we could obtain clear answers to each of these questions, and the answers would all line up in one column or another. Now, in reality, in any incident, not all of these questions can be answered. Often the evidence just isn't available or it's ambiguous. And often the answers don't all line up in the same column. So some of the words may actually appear threatening, but then there's no action to go with them. So in most instances, there will be uncertainty, ambiguity, confusion, and contradictory signals, which does not lend itself, by the way, to social science coding, as is often done in political science studies and theory. Now, in the second graphic, we see how some of this difficulty arises. The second graphic looks at the February 27, 2022 Russian, quote, nuclear alert. And you see, as you look through it, that Putin said it, so the leader said it, but it wasn't clear what the threat was. If you look at the actions, they weren't secret. It didn't involve nuclear warheads. It wasn't preparatory. There wasn't any other indication that Russia was getting ready to launch nuclear weapons, and there was absolutely no indication from the West that nuclear forces were going to be attacked. So it's not all lined up in the ideal way, but it's pretty clear this wasn't a credible nuclear threat. So then I turn to the third graphic, which in my opinion was arguably the only credible nuclear threat since 1962. And this was in the fall of 2022. And Putin made a clear speech on September 21 and 22, threatening to use nuclear weapons if necessary, and saying this wasn't a bluff. This came on the day that he announced a draft in Russia to bring more forces in. There was some concern that because the Russian forces had been routed in Kharkiv in the north and the Ukrainians were marching towards Kherson, this could become an existential threat to Putin, that there was a big risk of losing a big part of his army and the Ukrainians getting an inroad into Crimea, which was deemed an existential concern of Putin's. In this scenario, US intelligence detected indications amongst Russian military leaders of considering the use of tactical nuclear weapons. For these and other reasons, in kind of my framework that's there, a lot of the indicators are, if not red, orange, suggesting a credible threat. And that's why I conclude this was the case. Now, we can debate it, but arguably, this was the time since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. Now, let me emphasize that urgent nuclear threats have been extremely rare, and the term threat has been overused. But this does not mean that the risk of nuclear war is negligible. There are a lot of ways to get into a nuclear war without a leader making a clear threat before it started. And so there's much to be done to prevent inadvertent accidental wars and to improve communications. Now, the other happy news is not all manipulations of nuclear fear are coercive or frightening. There are also plenty of times when leaders want to relieve the fear of nuclear war. So they manipulate the nuclear fear in a sense by relaxing it. And with words or deeds such as reassuring their citizens that we're not going to have nuclear war, proposing summits and diplomatic discussions to resolve a conflict, embracing nuclear arms control and disarmament proposals, and conflict resolution. These are all forms of relieving nuclear threats. There was one that I particularly find interesting from Pakistan and India. Pakistan tested in May of 2002, when there was a big crisis. Pakistan tested several nuclear-capable missiles. The Indian Foreign Ministry de-escalated the situation and took the high ground by declaring, quote, India is not particularly impressed by these missile antics clearly targeted at the domestic audience in Pakistan. This was a fear-relieving statement by the Indian leadership. Now, in conclusion, I would say the wider and less precise our nuclear discourse is, the more fear nuclear manipulators can elicit, and the less precisely governments and citizenries will know when and how to counter them. If ambiguity is a preferred tactic of nuclear bullies, then clarity can be a tool of resistance. The need for more precision and clarity will grow as social media, with its brevity and zeal, becomes a conduit of manipulation. And we have less and less reliance on curated media with professional editors and fact-checking and other kinds of investigations. The environment is getting more and more conducive to kind of cheap manipulation by leaders. So my hope is that by encouraging more precise language and analysis to assess nuclear manipulations, we can enhance pressure on leaders to clarify their intentions, most importantly, with each other directly, if not publicly, for the wider world. Let me stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Let me hand over now to Anna Hood. Anna, the floor is yours. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be joining everyone today. My task today is... it's a real pleasure. Sorry, I've got feedback coming through. Let's try that again. It's a real pleasure to be joining you today. My task today is to talk a little bit about the role that international law plays in trying to regulate nuclear threats. And as Peter said at the start, this work comes out of research that I've done in conjunction with Associate Professor Monique Cormier. So today's presentation is both of our work coming to you. I think the key message that I want to convey dovetails quite nicely with where George left off, but unfortunately isn't very good news for George's call for clarity and precision. Unfortunately, I think we have very little clarity and precision at the international legal level around nuclear threats. What we have is a web of international laws that seek to govern threats, both general threats and specific nuclear threats, and there are plenty of loopholes, uncertainties, and limitations within them. So in my time today, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the general prohibitions on threats that exist at international law, and then I'm going to move on and talk about the prohibitions that exist in relation to specific nuclear threats. So kicking off with general prohibitions, where I want to go first is there is a key prohibition in international law that prohibits use of force, threats of use of force generally in peacetime, and that's found in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. So specifically what Article 2.4 says is that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. It seems pretty clear and comprehensive, but what we need to dig into is what is meant in Article 2.4 by that term threat. And we know from the literature that there are really 4 key criteria for determining if something is a threat in violation of Article 2.4. So first up, we can have either explicit or implicit threats. So explicit threats are when we have either writing or oral statements where a state clearly says that they're going to threaten another state. But that's not the only thing that's included. We also prohibit implicit threats. So that's situations where the behaviour or actions of a state might in the context seem to amount to a threat. So think, for example, if you had 2 states neighbouring each other and overnight one state starts a military build-up and getting the troops into action, in particular contexts, that could be enough to amount to an implied threat under Article 2.4. The next thing that we need for a threat is that it has to be directed at a specific entity. So it cannot just be issued to the world at large. The third thing that is needed is that the threat needs to be communicated publicly to the threatened entity. So oftentimes, you'll have politicians or military personnel who are talking about potentially using force. While those discussions remain private, they're not a violation of Article 2.4. They only become a violation once they're communicated to the other side. And then the fourth criterion for Article 2.4 is that the threat has to be credible. And the way international law judges what is credible differs a little from George's ideas around credibility, and I think that'll be a really interesting point for us to discuss further in the discussion part of today as to whether or not international law has got this right. But basically, in international law, a threat will be credible when 2 factors are in play. First, the state making the threat has to have the capacity, the capability of carrying out the threat. And secondly, it has to have some level of intention to carry it out. It doesn't have to be certain that it will carry it out. Really what we look at is, would the threatened entity have good reason for believing that aggression is being seriously contemplated? So if we have all those things, then we've got a threat that's in violation of Article 2.4. As with many laws, there are often exceptions and loopholes, and there's a pretty big exception to Article 2.4 set out in the UN Charter, and that is that it is permissible for states to make threats in situations of self-defence. So we know this from Article 51 of the UN Charter, and basically what the rules are here is that if a state has had an armed attack take place against it, or there's an imminent risk of an armed attack taking place, then that state is allowed to issue a threat in the hopes that it will prevent the attack or stop the armed attack that is taking place. The other situation where a threat is allowed is if a state decides that it wants to say, in the future, in the event that we are attacked, then we will use force of some description. So it can make a preemptive threat. The key thing with all threats that you make, for them to be legal, it has to be the case that the threatened force is necessary to bring the armed attack or imminent armed attack to a halt, and that the force threatened would be proportionate to the threat that's being faced. So there are a number of different boxes that need to be ticked. There are big disputes in international law as to whether a threat to use nuclear weapons would ever be permissible in self-defense. And in particular, there are questions around whether it would ever be necessary to threaten to use nuclear weapons to repel an attack, and or whether threatening to use nuclear weapons would ever be a proportionate threat of force. So views differ on this. This is one of the areas where we start getting some uncertainty creeping into this whole situation. I've just thrown a whole lot of law at you, and it might be helpful to break it down a bit by applying it to a couple of situations. So I'm going to talk about two specific sorts of threat we see in the international level and how they play out under Article 2.4 and the provisions of self-defense. The first is nuclear deterrence. As I'm sure everyone on this call is well aware, nuclear armed states adopt positions of nuclear deterrence, whereby they issue policy documents saying that in the event that they are attacked with weapons of mass destruction or overwhelming conventional force, they will deploy their nuclear weapons in response. So it's a clear threat that is in those doctrines. It's public, it's being communicated, and arguably it's credible. However, where most policies of nuclear deterrence fall short of being a threat under Article 2.4 is the fact that they're not directed at specific entities. They're threats that are issued to the world at large, and so for the vast majority of times, nuclear deterrence policies are not threats under Article 2.4. Second situation that I thought I'd talk about is one that George touched on briefly in his discussion, and that's around the dynamic between the US and North Korea. And I want to go back to an incident in 2016 in particular, when North Korea had tested a nuclear weapon. And in response, the United States flew a nuclear-capable B-52 bomber over the Republic of Korea with 2 fighter planes alongside. And it issued a statement at the time saying that the action it was taking was in response to recent provocative actions by North Korea. Now, this clearly isn't an explicit threat. No one in the US administration said we're going to use nuclear weapons against North Korea. But I think there's a strong case to be made that it was an implicit threat for the purposes of Article 2.4. Flying a nuclear-capable B-52 bomber along with the statement was made is showing that there is potential for a threat to be present. Where I think there may be some debate as to whether this amounts to a threat for Article 2.4 is whether the threat was credible. Now, under the credibility test of international law, the US clearly was capable and had the capacity to use nuclear weapons. It's perhaps debatable as to how much intention it had to carry out the threat. And I think different minds could come to different conclusions on that under the international legal test. Okay, so that gives you a bit of a snapshot into the rather messy way that international law deals with threats during peacetime generally. I want to turn now to what it does during wartime. And here we have to look to the body of law called international humanitarian law, which governs threats during times of conflict. And unfortunately, this gets even murkier because there is disagreement amongst international lawyers as to exactly which laws apply in times of law. Back in 1996, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on nuclear weapons. And in that case, it held that it is permissible to issue threats and nuclear threats if they comply with the key principles of international humanitarian law. So that's things like the principle of distinction, the principle of proportionality, and also the principle that means of warfare cannot cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. The ICJ in 96 didn't come to a definitive conclusion as to whether nuclear threats could satisfy the rules of IHL and could be permissible. It cast doubt on that, but it did leave open a little crack and window. And so we have had 30 years of debate as to whether or not nuclear threats could ever be permissible under the test cast. There's a lot of uncertainty. In addition to the ICJ's test, we have a number of international lawyers who have come out in recent years and said that actually the ICJ got it wrong when it set out the test for nuclear threats in wartime. And the reason they say they got it wrong is that in international humanitarian law, there are two very specific rules about when you can use threats and when you can't use threats in wartime. And at international law, when there are specific rules, we're meant to follow the specific rules and not the more general principles that the ICJ had regard to. So if we were to look at the more specific rules that exist in IHL, then a nuclear threat would not be permissible, firstly, when it was threatening the adversary with no survivors, and secondly, when there were threats of violence where the primary purpose was to spread terror amongst civilian populations. Now, if that's the law in wartime, then arguably quite a few nuclear threats would be permissible, because while nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear weapons is a huge catastrophic threat, it's not necessarily a threat that there will be absolutely no survivors. And at times, it's clear that while one purpose may be to spread terror, it's not necessarily the primary purpose. So the law in the space is extremely messy. Time's ticking along, so what I want to do in my last 3 minutes or so is just flip over and start looking at some of the international laws that exist that specifically target nuclear threats, not just general threats, but actual times nuclear threats are mentioned. And the first key set of laws here are negative security assurances. These are statements by nuclear armed states that they will not threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Over the last 3 decades, we've seen a number of nuclear armed states make these public declarations. Again, like the other areas, we've got some complexities and uncertainties. The first complexity is the fact that not all nuclear armed states have made these promises not to threaten to use nuclear weapons. China and Pakistan have made pretty comprehensive declarations in this line. The US, the UK, I need to make sure I get this right. India and North Korea have made some promises along these lines, but they've got carve-outs and times that they won't agree to stick with this promise. And Israel, France, and Russia have not made negative security assurances around nuclear threats. So there's a patchwork of who's covered by this. The second big limitation here is that there's a lot of debate as to whether these negative security assurances are legally binding. Under international law, unilateral statements will be binding if they're made publicly with the intention to be legally bound, but we've got a whole lot of debate from the nuclear armed states as to whether they actually do intend to be bound by these statements or not. The final category that I want to touch on before my time wraps up is treaties where we see prohibitions on nuclear threats. The first main treaty where we've got a clear prohibition is a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is just coming up to its 5-year anniversary of being having entered into force. This is in Article 11D of that treaty. States parties are prohibited from threatening to use nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, no nuclear armed state has signed that treaty at the moment, so that's a big limitation there. We also have nuclear weapon-free zone treaties, where, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that basically carve out areas of the globe where nuclear weapons can't be positioned or used. And each of those treaties has protocols that nuclear weapon states can sign on to. And when they sign on, they promise not to threaten to use nuclear weapons in the geographic area covered by the treaty. Sadly, there are some limitations here too. The first is that only the nuclear weapon states that have signed the NPT can sign these protocols. So it's the US, UK, China, France, and Russia. The other 4 can't sign them. Secondly, there's a huge disparity as to which protocols have been signed by the nuclear weapon states. Southeast Asian Treaty, for example, has had no state sign its protocols. And finally, along with what we've seen in other spaces, even when states have signed these protocols, they've often created carve-outs or limitations as to when their promises won't apply. So bringing it all together, we do have a number of laws governing threats, but they're quite murky. There's debate about when they apply, and there's a whole lot of limitations embedded within them. Many thanks.
Thank you, Anna. 2 wonderful presentations, excellent presentations with much food for thought. Let me hand over now to our 4 commentators. Our first will be Andy Tian. Over to you, Andy.
Hello. First, I would like to thank the Carnegie Endowment, the Nautilus Institute, and the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for convening this vital discussion. As many of you are aware, the Chinese government recently updated the white paper, China's Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation in a New Era, on November 27th, 2025. While I will not reiterate official lines here, I speak in my personal capacity to offer reflections on the rigorous and timely works presented by George Perkovich and Anna Hood. Those studies are essential. By analyzing nuclear threats through the lens of international law and state practice, the authors remind us that nuclear deterrence is not merely a technical calculation, it is a normative one. This is particularly urgent today as the expiration of bilateral arms control agreements between the United States and Russia has left the international community without binding quantitative constraints on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. And as the United States is launching a war in the Middle East on the grounds that Iran poses a nuclear threat, despite having declared only last June that it had eliminated all of Iran's nuclear facilities. In this context, a broader principle must be emphasized. Major powers must play an exemplary and a leading role in safeguarding strategic stability. With greater capability comes greater responsibility. Those states possessing the largest arsenals and the most advanced nuclear doctrines shoulder correspondingly great obligations, not only political, but also legal and moral. In particular, the United States and Russia, as the two major nuclear weapon states with the most extensive nuclear inventories, must assume primary and priority responsibilities in nuclear arms control and disarmament. Their conduct sets the tone for the entire non-proliferation regime. I offer some brief observations. First, the political erosion of law. The primary threat to nuclear stability today is not technological, it is political. When leaders suggest that the political will and moral compass are the only limits on state action, we witness a dangerous reversion to raw power politics. International functions not by eliminating power, but by disciplining it. If major powers come to believe that they can dispense with international law and treat legal constraints as optional or merely rhetorical, they don't just weaken a document. They erode the federal guardrails that prevent nuclear brinkmanship. The law of the jungle is a recipe for strategic catastrophe, not a foundation for a stable nuclear order. Precisely because of their strategic weight, major powers have a heightened duty to demonstrate restraint. When leading nuclear states undermine legal frameworks, the ripple effects are global. Conversely, when they recommit to arms control and disarmament obligations in good faith, they reinforce the credibility of the entire system. Second, the cost of selective consistency. We must also reflect on the current state of the rule-based order, particularly the role of European actors. There has been, at times, an extreme tolerance for unilateral withdrawals from treaties and coercive practices when they originate from traditional allies. If international law is invoked only when convenient, its authority evaporates. To strengthen the legal regulation of nuclear threats, consistency is indispensable. Legal norms cannot be treated as instruments of geopolitical preference. They must remain universal principles if they are to be respected by all. For the two largest nuclear weapon states, this consistency is especially critical. Arms control cannot survive if it becomes hostage to shifting political calculations. Leadership in this domain requires strategic patience and a willingness to place long-term stability above short-term advantage. Third, China's normative contribution. China is well positioned to contribute to the new legal norms proposed by the authors, specifically regarding standardized negative security assurance and the clarification of illegal nuclear rhetoric. A critical starting point is the principle of no first use. China has maintained this commitment since 1964, whether viewed as a declaratory policy or a binding doctrine. It serves as a normative restraint that narrows the window for nuclear contemplation. If more nuclear-armed states, particularly the major nuclear powers, were to institutionalize similar commitments, we would significantly reduce global ambiguity and enhance predictability. Norm building must be inclusive, but it must also be led. Without meaningful participation from states possessing the largest arsenals, normative progress risks becoming symbolic rather than structural. Fourth, navigating the structural dilemma. Finally, we must acknowledge the inherent tension. Deterrence thrives on ambiguity, while law demands clarity. Our challenge is not to dissolve deterrence overnight, but to incrementally shrink the legal gray zones that surround it. Through state practice, UN resolutions, and multilateral dialogue, we can shape expectations and constrain conduct. Here again, the behavior of major powers is decisive. If principal nuclear states demonstrate that legal clarity and strategic stability are mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory, they can gradually transform what today appears to be an irreconcilable dilemma. The central question of those papers are whether law remains irrelevant in a domain defined by existential fear. My answer is a firm yes, not because law is a magic shield, but because without it, nuclear politics is governed solely by force. In this era of intensifying competition, reaffirming the legal limits on nuclear threats is not an act of idealism. It is an act of prudence, and prudence begins with leadership, especially from those states whose arsenals and influence give them the greatest capacity to shape the nuclear order. Thank you all for listening. Thank you. Let me hand over back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Andy. I would like now to hand over to Carrie McDougall, for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have been asked to comment on the paper by Anna Hood and Monique Cormier, who are not only experts in the field, but are also long-term colleagues of mine. At the outset, I wanted to note that Anna and Monique do not restrict the meaning of nuclear threat to the meaning ascribed to the term threat under the jus ad bellum, or the law on the use of force, which, as Anna reminded us, would require an express or implied promise directed at a specific victim that nuclear weapons will be used unlawfully, generally conditional on a particular demand not being met. Instead, Anna and Monique extend their definition of the phrase nuclear threat to include gestures to do harm, allusions to the idea that nuclear weapons might be used. And they note that they do this very deliberately in order to consider at what point a threat to use nuclear weapons might cross a legal line. But I confess that I kept tripping over the extended meaning of the phrase nuclear threat. It will come as no surprise that George's argument about the importance of nomenclature resonated strongly with me. So in these brief comments, I'm going to distinguish between a threat to use nuclear weapons when I'm talking about a threat in the classic international law sense. And I'm going to refer to conduct that would not meet the definition of a threat under international law, or at least the law on the use of force, as nuclear braggadocio. So as we heard from Anna, the paper first seeks to elaborate on the meaning of the term threat under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, seeking to identify a bright line to distinguish between lawful and unlawful conduct. And in this context, the paper suggests that language such as "we will use all tools at our disposal" could amount to a threat under international law, as could a nuclear deterrence policy if developed in response to concerns about a specific state. We just heard from Anna that the paper also suggests that the US flying a nuclear-capable B-52 bomber over South Korea, flanked by 2 fighter jets, in response to a North Korean nuclear weapons test, would meet the definition of threat for for jus ad bellum purposes in the view of the authors. Now, I'm not myself convinced that any of those examples amount to threats, not least in light of the ICJ's finding in the Nicaragua case that continuous US military and naval maneuvers adjacent to Nicaragua's borders in quite a hostile political environment, the court found those actions did not amount to a threat to use force. And what's important, I think, is that the existence of differing views on these concrete examples highlights the fact that there is, as we've heard, a lack of clarity around exactly what constitutes a threat for jus ad bellum purposes. And so I'm wondering if Anna and, of course, Monique would agree that actually what we need, rather than new law, is definitional clarity. After all, if we're uncertain about what a threat is as a matter of law, it is very hard to enforce a prohibition against the threat of unlawful military force. The paper next turns to international humanitarian law. Again, I'm not entirely convinced by the examples here. Putin's statement that Russia would make all use of all weapons systems available to it in the event of a threat to its territorial integrity was addressed to leading NATO countries rather than Ukraine, meaning that the question of whether this amounted to a prohibited threat can only be assessed under the jus ad bellum, not IHL. Nevertheless, the key point highlighted in the paper is that it's unclear whether the ICJ was right to conclude that threats to use nuclear weapons will be unlawful during armed conflict if the use of those weapons would be unlawful, or whether the only applicable IHL rules are those that outlaw threatening an adversary that there'll be no survivors and threatening violence in order to spread terror among the civilian population. Now, I personally am in the camp that takes the view that the ICJ's conclusion about the existence of a general prohibition against threats is not supported by widespread and representative state practice or opinio juris, requirements to find a rule of customary international law exists, meaning that the court was essentially wrong. And I suspect that view, not least in light of my prior government service, is one that is shared by at least nuclear-armed and nuclear umbrella states. Now, Anna and Monique very clearly have concerns about such a conclusion and what they see as the paucity of IHL's otherwise applicable rules. But I'd be interested in exploring this further because it seems, at least in part, to hinge on an implied suggestion that once you have an armed conflict and IHL becomes applicable, we forget all about the jus ad bellum. And I just don't think that's right as a matter of law. So to put it plainly, do we need IHL to regulate threats to use nuclear weapons, given the existence of other applicable rules? After concluding that negative security assurances add little to the legal landscape and that neither the TPNW nor the Nuclear Weapon Free Zone treaties presently have any practical effect, the authors conclude that there are lacunas in the law and they identify ways that states could fill the gap with new measures. Now, this conclusion proceeds on an assumption that it is not only threats to use nuclear weapons that need to be prohibited, but also that nuclear braggadocio needs to be prohibited or at least regulated. Now, the risks of gunboat diplomacy are pretty obvious, but I would argue that that type of conduct is already captured by the prohibition on the use of force. So my question is whether Anna could unpack for us the exact harm that the authors think is caused by nuclear braggadocio. My final question is about the practicalities of Anna and Monique's proposed gap-filling measures. It is, of course, entirely credible to adopt the view that the current geopolitical environment makes the regulation of nuclear weapons more urgent than ever. At the same time, current geopolitical tensions would seem to make the possibility of concluding new rules on nuclear weapons less likely than ever, particularly when it comes to rules the agreement on which proved elusive at the height of international law's ambition. So in that context, my question is whether the proposals made are realistic, or perhaps to put it more kindly, how could we prioritise or shape the initiatives identified in the paper to make them as realistic as possible? Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. I will now hand over to Paul Davis. Thank you, Paul.
Sure. I'm going to comment on George Perkovich's paper and then just make a couple comments at the very end on the legal issues. I think it's possible in principle to prove that what George Perkovich was trying to do is impossible. If you imagine a sort of working deterrence problems by having models of two sides, a red and a blue, you'd have to worry about what's the model of red and what's the model of red's blue, because what red does depends on what he thinks blue is up to. But then that would depend appropriately on reds, blues, reds, and reds, blues, reds, blues, red. There's sort of an infinite regression. So if we start thinking about gestures and braggadocio and general illusions and so forth, these are perceived as meaning something, but what the meaning is depends on what you think the other guy has in mind when he lets you see these things. And it's all made more complicated by the fact that real people, as well as models, make decisions based on perceptions, but some of the things that they're supposed to be able to perceive don't show up. Maybe they get delayed, or maybe they get misinterpreted in the diplomatic sphere. And to make things even worse, our models of our adversaries and our models of our adversaries' models of us have to be probabilistic, because we know that we can't be sure what the other guy is going to do, and he can't be sure what we're going to do. And so all of this means it's probably impossible. Having said that, I really like George's paper because, as a practical matter, leaders are not all that subtle, and they're not really working at the level of infinite regression. They're making first order mistakes or first order judgments, sometimes second order, but things are not that subtle. We're much more, as a practical matter, we're much more concerned about really major mistakes, such as failing to see warning signs, or overreacting to warning signs and making things worse rather than better, or escalating in ways that are inappropriate. Those are the practical problems. And so I think that George's paper is a really good and well-structured attempt to decode the goings on. I would use some terms a little differently, but I like the basics, including one of the important subtleties, which is that when you're looking at actions, you have to distinguish between, well, is that action really a threat? Is it a threat, or is it really just a precautionary measure taken by the other side to be sensible to improve survivability and readiness? These are really important criteria that I think senior officials do try to apply, but they probably don't have the structure to do so consistently. So I like all of those things. Now, some general cautions. There is sometimes a hidden assumption in forums like this and discussions of nuclear issues that limited nuclear war is as bad as general nuclear war, and that limited nuclear war is maybe not a real thing because nuclear war would just become catastrophic. And I think this is fundamentally wrong, and it has been wrong forever. And we've seen in recent years further indications that indeed limited nuclear war is feasible, and it could conceivably even have a winner. And so this complicates things, because some of the things that are seen as hollow threats are perhaps to be taken more seriously, as George mentioned in his examples, with the Russians actually having serious discussions internally about how nuclear weapons could be used in the Ukrainian context. Another general caution that I would lay out is that all of these matters of trying to interpret the gestures and the arm waving and the braggadocio and the actions are dependent upon the personalities, certainly of the leaders, and sometimes of their militaries or their organizations. And this should really give us pause in an era where we have major leaders like Putin and Trump and Xi. These are not the kind of leaders that people had in mind when they wrote the books on deterrence back in the 1960s and 70s. These are people who are not accepting the principles and norms and constructs that have dominated political science discussions of these matters for decades. So norms just have no meaning to these people. If we're talking about China, if China talks about the inevitability of uniting with Taiwan with force by necessary, what principle is that based on that isn't just might makes right or something of that sort? When Putin invades Ukraine, what does that have to do with international law? It's a complete, total repudiation of half a century of thinking. When Trump, in his mercurial manner, threatens in various ways, and when he ignores various norms of American society and governments, this is all telling us we're living in a different age than the age that spawned the arms control agreements, the international law on aggression and things. So this should give us a lot of pause, and I don't know what to suggest we do as a result, but we do want to be really cautious in if we implicitly are assuming that leaders are going to behave in the future as civilized society had decided they should be acting in the era in which many of us grew up. I'm older than most, if not everybody else on here, and my entire professional life has been involved in periods where there was an ascendance of things like rules of war, laws of international conflict, the UN Charter, the belief that countries should not invade each other. Well, these norms are clearly not accepted anymore. And so that means that as we talk about issues like signals and threats and what's permissible and impermissible, we really need to do so in a different context than the one we grew up with. And I find that very discouraging, but it seems to me it's just part of reality. Now, fortunately, there is some reason to believe that over time, the principles will reemerge, will be reaccepted to some degree, but others will not. And I think we need to distinguish more carefully between those that really do have staying power and those that perhaps we were fooling ourselves if we believed that they were fundamental and universal. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. And our fourth commentator is Kazuko Hikawa. Kazuko, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. And George, thank you for sharing your excellent work. So my comments are mainly focused on George's paper. And I will also make some comments on these legal issues. So first, I completely agree with George's view that the word threat is overused. And also we need to be careful when using the word threat, because when I was in Osaka in 2020, when the invasion of Ukraine started, I was often asked by people like students or the ordinary people in Osaka whether I believe that the nuclear war will really actually started. The threat is so imminent. And my answer was always no. And when I started reading George's paper, I was surprised to see the line that the Voice of America reported that Russia had made 135 nuclear threats between February 24th and December 17th, February 24th, 2002, and December 17th, 2024, because no way, I did not think that so many threats were made by Russia. And then later in his paper, he clarified that this is not real threats. So there are no 135 threats actually. And I'm very relieved because the media widespread reporting on the heightened threat of use of nuclear weapons, and it affected not only the ordinary people in Japan, but also politicians. And there was a lower house election in 2020 in May, I think May, or anyway, after March, and then the political party based in Osaka, they included or they made nuclear sharing a key pledge in its election campaign, without defining what they mean by nuclear sharing. It all came from this kind of heightened threat perception. And it still affects the discourse about nuclear weapons in Japan. Not only nuclear weapons, but also Japanese defense policy. And as you may know, the Japanese government decided to increase the percentage of military expenditure of the GDP up to now 2.7%. We had always 1% ceilings, but it is already gone after 2022. So I really agree with I think that the point of George's paper is two sides or 2 points. One is the focus is two. One is the people, the general public, and the other is decision makers or officials. And these two, targets, I would say targets, are very important because, of course, the government decision makers, officials are more careful usually with terms, wordings, or language, but general public, no. But the perception of general public, as I just explained, can influence the policy. So I think this is really important that we have a common understanding, or at least that we need to be careful with the terms. And so in the content, about the content of George's paper, I have some comments. When understand someone's intentions, it was mentioned that the personality or person's character of person is important. It's written somewhere in the paper. But I think that not only personal factors, but also the culture in terms of practice, it's also very important. For example, in his book China 4.0, Edward Woodward explained the difference between Russia and China's behavior, how they are consistent with their own words or not. That's a very good book. And I think that there are differences. Or, for example, because I was former diplomat, I want to bring this story. So during the elections of international organizations, one must be also very cautious with wording or language, because the same words can carry different meanings depending on the cultural context, in which cultural or practice context in which they are used. For instance, it is well known that when responding to a request for support, for example, from us, a certain country will state, we will positively consider it. We will positively consider it, in which in practice means they will likely not support us. This is because we know it because from our past experience, that if a certain country say, if we will say that we will positively consider it, it means no. In other hand, for example, another country might state, we support you. We support your candidate. However, again, from experience, we know that it does not mean they will support us. We know that only from our, experience or practice. So in that case, for example, we ask them for written support, or still, if we know that written support is not effective, we will ask for cross support, which means that when the other country support our candidate, then we will support their candidate in other election, for example. So, again, I completely agree with the idea of creating a shared understanding of what specific vocabulary means. And in that sense, and especially not for general public, but for decision makers or officials or for government, I had been paying attention to the P5 process, which was launched to build a common understanding on strategic stability, including vocabulary related to strategic stability. So they had agreed on glossary, on terms or wordings they will use. Although it has stalled since the invasion of Ukraine, I hope this process will be reactivated to find a common language. Finally, I have a question to George. So about the questions you posed in your paper to assess the threat, the question 3 and 4 seem to be subjective in nature. Could you please explain a little bit more about intent behind question 3 and 4, in particular question 4, because I think it is very much difficult to the action, whether we need imminent action or not, is pretty much depending on the analysis or assessment itself, whether we need imminent action or not. So I would like to hear your view, whether you think that it is possible to, judge whether imminent action is needed with that, in that kind of situation. I think I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kazuko. We are running over time. What I'd like to do now is hand back to our two presenters to give us some very, very quick feedback, perhaps 2 minutes each, on any of the topics that have been mentioned by the commentators. So Anna and George, over to both of you.
Anna, you go first, if that's all right. I mean, I'm happy to, but I'm happy to have you go first if you like. Or, well, why don't I go?
George, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah. So to Kazuko's very good question, and thanks for all the comments. They're terrific. On the question of how can you tell if imminent action is necessary, what I have in mind there is, for example, like the scenario that was worrying that the city of Kherson in Ukraine would be, the Russian forces would be in a day or two destroyed around Kherson, and then Ukraine could get over the river. So a major military disaster that looks like it's happening within hours or days. Or, for example, it appears that the adversary is preparing to launch their nuclear weapons. You've intercepted an order that's been given to launch those nuclear weapons. You have to decide whether to launch your nuclear weapons within minutes or hours. That kind of imminence is what I have in mind, a very, very urgent situation. Let me, while we're waiting for Anna, pick up a couple of questions that came in from viewers and we saw in the chat. So somebody asked, for example, if exercises, military exercises could be considered as threats. I would defer to Anna on the legality of that. But my own thought would be, well, if you can't exercise your military forces, then how would you have them? You have, all militaries must exercise. And if international society considers an exercise a threat, then everybody would be facing threats year round every year. So there has to be something allowed for military threats. And then I think Anna and Monique write about all options are on the table, which is an interesting question. There was a question from the audience, like, is all options on the table considered to be legally a threat? And Peter Hayes at Nautilus had uncovered a document, not uncovered, but gotten released a document from the U.S. Command of Nuclear Weapons that says exactly that. They use that expression, all options are on the table, precisely to avoid being legally accused of making a nuclear threat. So that whether that's the right legal interpretation, I don't know, but it is a conscious choice to not be accused of making an illegal threat. Let me stop there and turn it back to Anna.
Thank you. And my apologies for the technical difficulties at my end. I'm hoping you can hear me now.
Yeah, we can.
Amazing. Thank you so much to the panel for the wonderful comments. They're really rich reflections. In 2 minutes, I can probably only touch on a couple of points. So the first one that I might speak briefly to is Carrie raised the really important point of whether what scope of threat should we be seeking to limit and capture with international law, and cast doubt on the idea that we should go too far. And I love the term nuclear braggadocio. It's a great term. I guess to put out some thoughts as to why we might want to capture a slightly larger category of threat than perhaps some others on the call would be comfortable with. I think even when it falls short of a very clear, explicit threat, even we've got this bravado going around, there are consequences to that. There are consequences in terms of the psychological fear and anxiety it creates within populations. There are potential security issues with that level of bravado being thrown around and where that can lead. And I think, too, it has disarmament implications. To put my cards on the table, I'm someone who's very pro-nuclear disarmament. And I think the more that we have language being bandied around in the international sphere that relies on nuclear weapons and forms of nuclear bravado, the more that lends legitimacy to states having them, the more use and political and strategic use that they get out of it, making them more viable. So I think there are a host of reasons why we might want to think about a relatively broad prohibition. The other point I'll just touch on very briefly is the very fair point that we are currently in an age where getting agreement on any matters at the international level, let alone nuclear ones, seems ambitious to say the least. And of course, we're in a very different age to when Monique and I actually wrote this paper just a few years ago. We were heading towards a point where there was difficulty at the international point, but when we were writing this back in 2023, we weren't at the point we're at now. I don't know that that means we should completely abandon hopes of generating new norms and ideas. It may not be, the time may not be right now, but that doesn't mean we step away from the conversations and the different ideas. I think we need to be open to different ways and spaces. We shouldn't expect this is all going to be tied up nicely in a bow anytime soon, but I think that doesn't mean it's not important to engage in the questions. I'll leave it there so we've got time for some others to jump in. Thanks so much.
Thank you. What I might do at this point is just refer to a couple of the audience questions. George has mentioned a couple of them already, but I'll read out one of the questions and then open up for comments from any of the presenters or commentators. One question is, how should international law account for nuclear signaling that is deliberately ambiguous, such as moving assets, presumably nuclear assets, or changing alert levels without explicit verbal threats? Your thoughts?
I can dive in very quickly, but I don't want to hog the floor. So very quickly, I'd say my sense is that we need that sort of action may fall short of what we should cover under the international law around threats and nuclear threats in particular. That may not be the right space, but that it is important that we have international legal conversations about that. And in particular, I think in terms of nuclear disarmament, the nuclear disarmament obligation in Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty requires states to be actively moving towards nuclear disarmament. And so things that prohibit that are problematic. So I think there are frameworks already that we can have some conversations around those sorts of actions. It may well be that others would be useful too. Thanks.
George?
I defer to Carrie. I'd like her to come in on the legal part. My only thought is we get back to the issue about whether the action is defensive and meant to stabilize the situation and not escalate it. So I might move nuclear forces or put them on alert precisely to avoid having to use them because I want to make it more difficult for the opponent to attack me first. And so how you interpret these things legally, it strikes me as being super difficult.
Any of the commentators wish to respond to that question?
Sure. I mean, I would absolutely agree with Anna. I think it's important to recognise that you can have a threat for the purposes of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, communicated through action alone. You don't need a verbal signalling. You don't need a condition that has to be fulfilled. In saying that, I would agree with Anna that moving nuclear assets, changing alert levels by themselves would not meet the definition of a threat under international law. And that's a reflection of the fact that in interpreting this prohibition, states have really set the threshold quite high. You really need something very concrete to get a reaction for states to say that a legal line has been crossed.
Any other contributions before we move to the next question? In that case, I will read out another audience question. If nuclear weapons exist purely for deterrence, Why do the US, Russia, and China maintain stockpiles far beyond what that requires? What's the actual strategic justification? And does international law have anything to say about the size of these nuclear arsenals? George, go for it.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and then Paul has worked on this in great detail for decades. But I would distinguish historically between China on the one hand and the US and Russia on the other, because until very recently anyway, China had a clearly minimal nuclear deterrent, scores of weapons that could have hit the United States, which was its primary adversary, a no first use doctrine, never made nuclear threats. So clearly for deterrence. I would argue that's still their policy, but I would also argue the president of China should come out and explain why they're doing what they're doing and their buildup and so on. There's a lot of doubt growing about whether the policy is changing. For the US and Russia, and Paul should correct me if I'm wrong, I would argue they have way more than they need for deterrence, but that they are operating under a different model of deterrence where they feel they have to be able to destroy the other side's nuclear forces and limit the damage the other side could do back to them to make their posture credible. So they're animated by fighting each other's nuclear forces, so that if one side's numbers go up, then your numbers have to go up to try to take their numbers away. And especially when the US withdrew from the treaty limiting missile defenses, this became a more acute concern. Not my version of what's necessary for deterrence, but under the model they have, this is where it's driven them. But Paul can correct that.
Yeah, Paul, please go ahead.
Well, I certainly agree with what George just said. There's a great irony that one of the advances that was argued for many years was that military thinking was shifting toward a belief that you can't innocent people. You have to have a war at least restricted to the battlefield. If you're going to restrict it to the battlefield, that means going after each other's weapons and armies. And there were excellent papers and things written on this throughout the Cold War, but they led to this mindset that we have to focus on, as you said, the ability to deal with the military forces, and for if the other guy builds more forces, we have to build more forces. If they're becoming more destructive, we have to be able to defeat their guy who thinks he can fight the. Now that was the trend. But now we are in a period where in Gaza, in Ukraine, and then elsewhere, killing people and destroying societies and structures are now back in fashion, I guess. Now this is not much discussed, but the notion that military action should be focused on military things seems to be out the window, at least temporarily. And if you're in that world, then the simpler concept of what should be adequate for deterrence would be smaller numbers of weapons, but it would be with the expectation that if they were used, they'd go kill other people, innocent people, in the other side's countries. So the irony is, which of these models is more appropriate or has more lasting power? And it's not going to be resolved. It's been around for a long time.
I would add to that the expiration of the New Treaty a couple of weeks ago means that these numbers could go up even more, as the questioner points out, why do we have such high numbers? Unfortunately, not only are things like discussions, debates, summit meetings, confidence building measures out of fashion, but we have now lost just about all of the arms control measures that we had between the two superpowers. We have run out of time, and I apologize for the fact that we've not been able to get to every questioner and every speaker, but we now have reached the end of this session. And I will therefore thank all of our speakers, our two presenters, for wonderful papers, and our four commentators for their insightful questions. Thank you to the audience. I'm sure that this will be made available online for you in due course, or for anybody who has missed this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.